1 Samuel 28 and 29. Saul is about to go into battle again with or against the Philistines, and so he does again what a king would do, and that is inquire of his God, supposedly Yahweh. Yahweh again is not talking to Saul. Evidence again that he's not a Yahwist. And so Saul says, let me inquire of a spiritist or a medium. And the word used here for a spiritist is a very general term. It's someone who has contact with the spiritual world. Israel is the only country that we have found evidence of in the ancient world that did not allow, as far as an official religion, of course, Israel did not allow its people to use spiritists. It's very common in the ancient world otherwise. And so Saul visits this woman. She lives in Endor, a city just about 10 miles away from where Saul was staying that night before the battle started. He went to her and asked her directly, I need to talk to Samuel. Now Samuel had died, and the idea that there is life after death has always been a kind of a mystery to this point in the biblical story. But Saul believed that contacting Samuel was possible. Well, we don't have a lot of detail in the story except what happens. This woman, oops, that's a woman there. This woman somehow, and she seems to see things but not hear things, she sees a being, and she calls it an Elohim. Saul seems to hear what is going on, and he says, well, what kind of a being do you see? And she admits it's an old man. Well, that gives Saul the idea that this must be Samuel. And so he is excited to talk to Samuel in a sense. Everything that he wants is now coming to pass. He can now talk to this prophet and understand God's will because he was God's man, God's prophet. Well, Samuel is, in a sense, frustrated by being called up, as it were, from the dead, and says to Saul, well, everything I've told you before is still true. God will take the kingdom from you. By the way, the battle you will lose tomorrow, and you will, in fact, die, you and your son. By the way, then, is this story true? We've always wondered about this because, again, of this strangeness to it, right? I would go with what the text seems to imply, or what the narrator wanted us to get from the story, and that is, in some way, the narrator does seem to say that Samuel actually was there. The spirit of Samuel was somehow contacting our world. Well, what do we do with this story? In a larger sense, it does have bearing, again, on where we are in the bigger story of the Bible, because in Leviticus 19 and 20, and also Deuteronomy 18, we have had previously in the law very strict prohibition for Israel to ever be in contact with a spiritist. It's spelled out very clearly. Again, that shows or tells me, recommends in my understanding of the Bible that it's real. He wouldn't be saying this if it was just made up. So this again gets back to that Which Elohim storyline that seems to be so vital to the story of Scripture. In fact, when we get farther down into Israel and even the exile, again, the story of Adam, Genesis 3, that will basically never come up again. But what we will have in 1 Kings or 2 Kings 21 and 22, when the exile is about to happen, this text or this idea, and specifically mediums and spiritists, are brought into the discussion as to why God's anger was so hot at the end of Israel's time before the exile. One last thing is to be mentioned about Saul and his own death, as recorded in 1 Chronicles 10 later in the story. Listen to why Saul dies on the battlefield. So Saul died, 1 Chronicles 10:13, so Saul died for his unfaithfulness against Yahweh, because he consulted a medium for guidance. Because Saul did not inquire of Yahweh, Yahweh killed him.